All right, so in general, growing up, didn't love school. Not a particularly unpopular opinion there. I think most people didn't. But as I started to get a little bit older, most people kind of came around to viewing it all as fairly necessary and important, and I never did. I never really came around to the view that the struggle I felt I was being put through was in any way worth it. And so there was a couple of things that I maintained as criticisms of school, and I actually remember on many, many occasions having a really bad day and swearing to myself that once I became an adult that I would never forget what it was like, and that I would change it, that I would never hoist the same kind of fucked up expectations upon my children. So clearly I was maybe a little bit more angry than the average young person at the school system. So I still pretty much stand by most of what I was mad at then, and in fact, so does the research. This is a great book here. I actually recommend people read this one, because I've actually read this one, and it's pretty concise. The Homework Myth by Alfie Kohn. That book starts off, the first chapter, it lays out a bunch of research showing that, for the most part, expanding the amount of homework young people have does not improve learning and acts as a detriment to their learning. Pretty substantive research in the first chapter proving his point, right? But that's only the first chapter. The remainder of the book is him explaining why we still do it. And most of it is just this sort of psychological thing where parents just believe that the more hard work is being hoisted upon their children, the better they will become, the stronger a learner they will become. And it has very little to do with evidence that this works. It has very little to do with I would say empathy for the child, right? And it has everything to do with just a sort of meritocratic belief that no pain, no gain. So if there's pain, there must be gain, basically. If you believe no pain, no gain, you end up reversing it and thinking, oh, hey, we're creating a lot of struggle for these young people, so it must be doing something. And there's a desire to almost load up these young people with as much as they can, especially at that young age when they're got that neuroplasticity, to just shove them full of homework in the hopes that it helps. But in practice, it not only doesn't help the students, it burdens the parents, because a lot of this, it's homework, right? So they can't ask a teacher for help. They can't ask somebody who knows how to help them for help anymore. So they're going home to their parents. And I remember a lot of times going up to my parents and being like, Mom, what the fuck does this question mean? And she would be she'd be looking at it, she'd be looking at the phrasing, and she's like, I don't know. I don't know. Why do they give you these weird I don't know what it means. But you know who does know what that question means? Hopefully. The teacher who wrote the question down. She knows what she meant by that. So maybe spend more time in settings where that teacher is around. I would even be down if we do away with significant portions of the homework that exists. I think I would have even been down for an extra hour or two a day of class time. Even as a young person who hates school, hated school, that is a trade-off I would have taken. Oh, you mean I don't have to remember these difficult assignments to turn them in? I don't have to self-organize at home? I'm gonna have this very structured environment where I'm actually around the people who are teaching me the material. And that's sort of the other argument, right? That's sort of another thing that comes up with homework, is the goal of sort of teaching people to be more organized. But in my experience, at least, that doesn't work. Maybe the ADHD contributed there. But in my experience, trying to teach people to be organized doesn't really work by just throwing them out of the nest, you know? The best way to teach people to be organized is to put them in a format where they're pretty consistently organized anyways, and then just allow that habituation to continue through, right? Every day you do this checklist together, and then you expect that when they're out on their own, now they're used to doing that checklist. Whereas you just push people out and kind of hope that they remember to turn in their homework, and then people kind of have to figure out their own method. In my experience, it takes away from all of the other subjects you're teaching. Right? You're teaching math, you're teaching English, you're teaching all these other subjects. But the one subject that the student is actually learning is like how to remember to write everything down on the calendar so that they know what dates things are due. And if they're failing at that subject, they're failing at every other subject, and they don't have to be. So, less homework, I think. I honestly think this is weird that this isn't like a movement. I would think that you could organize young people pretty easily into an anti-homework rebellion. You'd think that one would be an easy sell, but maybe not. So next hot take, we start off with wild hot take: homework bad. Okay. Math bad as well. The Math Myth by Andrew Hacker, who was a friend of Alfie Kohn. Alfie Kohn wrote a section of this like a review of this book. The Math Myth argues that, especially in preparation for STEM, there's been an overabundance of trying to force all kids to go down this one STEM pathway, and it's well-intentioned. You know, STEM is definitely a field where people could succeed and make a lot of money, but just because it's a field where you can succeed and make a lot of money doesn't mean 100% of students need to be pushed onto that path 100% of the time, and it doesn't work, because students that aren't responding well to it, they're going to gravitate in a different direction, and then you're forcing them. And in general, I think education works better when it's a little bit more participatory. You know, if they're kicking and struggling the whole time, they're probably not going to do a whole lot of learning. So less math, I think, would be great. The details of that are in here. It's mostly STEM program related, but it's also, a lot of that is like trigonometry and calculus. That's the type of math he's talking about cutting out. Not basic arithmetic, of course. Maybe a little bit of like early algebra, but no higher algebras, no calculus, no trig, none of that stuff, right? And specifically, he's talking about cutting that out from mandatory education programs, right? Because obviously, if you want to take trigonometry and you're passionate about trigonometry, I have no problem with that. That's a weird conversation that ends up coming up a lot, because liberals are very concerned with programs getting cut for funding, understandably. And so you end up having to argue with people about the value of certain programs, and like which studies are more important than others. And there's a very strong emphasis amongst liberals that the arts, music and art and theater and stuff, are like super, super important and undervalued. And what they mean is they're undervalued in terms of funding. They're undervalued because people want to cut them as like non-essential. But when I say I don't think those are like the most important subjects in the world, like music and art or what have you, it's not because I don't want them to be offered to students who are passionate about music and art. It's because I don't want them to be forced upon students who aren't passionate about music and art. It's a different thing, right? And this author also suggests something that ties into a broader theme of my beliefs about education, which is that he says we should have a sort of citizens mathematics. He says that we should combine a sort of a civics class with a math class and teach people how to understand the use and abuse of statistics in the real world, right? Once they know a sort of applied probability and statistics course, then they can look at various information coming out of books, coming out of the media in the world they live in, and they'll be stronger citizens as a result of that. This, to me, makes a lot more sense because I'm a firm believer that citizenship is a part of everyone's life. Being an engineer or a computer technician is not a part of everyone's life. That's a part of a small handful of people's lives, dependent upon their career path. The citizen statistics route, that's the type of math that maybe everyone could use a little bit of more of. So I think rewriting the math programs to focus more on that makes a lot of sense. And this draws into my next sort of big conclusion here. Schools should be democratic. They should be democratized. They should be controlled not just by like the local parents, but by the kids. Like I said in the first section, right, part of the reason why so much of this homework gets suggested, it's not like the system is like not responding to parents. It's not like it's not hearing out parents' demands. The parents are demanding this. The parents want as much homework as possible against the evidence and against the will of their children a lot of time. And I think this comes back to a sort of a libertarian idea that when you're working with other people's money, when you're making rules about other people, you don't think about how it affects them so much. You don't have an incentive to worry about the effect it has on them because you're not the person being directly affected. So you can manage it in a way that to you maybe seems well-intentioned, but it doesn't have the desired outcomes. So I'm a firm believer that in general, democracy, when we talk about democracy, if you're talking about it in terms of like who is going to make the best decisions, then you're not talking about it right. Because obviously, the masses of everybody, controversial take here, are stupid. We don't know as much about government as a small handful of representatives. We don't know as much about government as like the elites or experts. Obviously, a monarch who was raised from birth to rule would know more than the average person, of course, right? That's not the reason you should believe in democracy. It's not because democracy produces good decision making or like really positive, intelligent outcomes. It's because it makes the system accountable to you. You could make a very efficient government, a very efficient society where half the population is fully enslaved to the other half. And it would be super, super productive, I'm sure, because you've taken away the quality of life of half the population and you've just enslaved them. But productive for who? Right? That's the question. For democracy to function, it needs to be productive for you. That's the point of it, is to make the system and all of the decision making it does ultimately accountable to everybody. Right? There are definitely a lot of flaws in the way that operates, and I've talked about different systemic changes we could make to make it more functional, and less sort of rigidly egalitarian, because I think that's one of the fundamental problems, is like the rigidly egalitarian, majoritarian nature of democracy, but you still need it to be highly accountable to ordinary people. And so democratizing the schools, I think, would be something that inevitably leads to a lot of these other decisions. If you put forward, hey, how much higher algebra should be mandatory to the actual students themselves, I think they would come to a conclusion very similar to Andrew Hacker and the math myth. I think if you asked the actual young people, hey, how much homework do you want every night, they would come to a conclusion very similar to that of Alfie Kohn on their own, without any elite interference. And so in general, I think that would refocus education on what it needs to be focused on. There are some other subjects that I think could be completely rewritten in the same way as well, right? Like, not only do I think we should change math from being this like highly career focused thing to being something that's maybe a little bit more citizen focused, something that's more like a civics class. But you could also do that with history. When you learn history right now, it's just a series of like names and places, and it's pretty faceless, it's pretty alien. It's not at all clear why this history matters, right? But if you ask anybody, like, why are we teaching kids history? Why is that essential? They'll say something along the lines of like, well, if you don't learn your history, then you're doomed to repeat it. Something like that, right? Some old aphorism. Well, if the whole point of learning about history is to learn about the present, is to change what we do in the present, then why not just start with the present, right? History is, a lot of it is political history. We're not learning the history of HVAC units. We're not learning the history of automobile production. We're learning the history of global events. So it's political. So why not start with politics and work backwards to history, instead of starting with disassociated massive history talking points and then occasionally throwing in some current events? It just seems inside out to me. And in addition to teaching things like citizenship, because like obviously as a politics nerd, I'm going to be disproportionately of the belief that it would be great if more people learned about politics, right? Of course, it's kind of self-serving. But in addition to stuff like that, I also think that people should learn more about like just their life. Like it's been said a million times that we should teach people how to file their taxes, you know, stuff like that. But there's other entire things that we don't teach. Parenting, I think, would be a big one. I think it would be great if we also taught how to have a relationship. Both of those things, right? Emotional maturity and communication in romantic relationships, in friendships, and also like how to parent, and all of that could be done pluralistically. I'm a firm believer in like opening this up to a diversity of perspectives. I really do see what conservatives are saying in like a censorship of conservative perspectives right now. I'm all for a full pluralistic education here. So don't think that just because I'm talking about like educating kids in public schools on how to parent, that means I think the government should like figure it out ahead of time, like what parenting is, and then teach that to everybody. No, I think there should be a diversity of perspectives and a conversation and a debate taking place in the classroom every day. And if we did that, I think it would make the whole world a better place. Like we teach sex education, but that's not the entirety of what we actually need to learn. Like using a condom is not sex. It's not relationships. You need to learn how to actually be a person fully, and we don't teach that. And that's the only thing that we know every single one of these kids is going to do in adulthood. We don't know they're going to go to college. Most of them maybe won't, right? We don't know what career they're going to go into. A lot of them are going to end up at entry-level jobs. Inevitably, our economy would not function if a lot of people didn't somehow end up at entry-level jobs, right? So, the only thing we know they're going to do is they're probably going to, like, date or have friends or have kids at some point. Those are the only things that we could be relatively confident that they're going to do, and we don't teach them anything about that. So, in general, I guess my three principles are like accountability, teaching the essentials of what every single person needs. That's the only stuff I think should be like really mandatory. The rest of things I think should be very participatory, very pluralistic, and very piecemeal. I'm very frustrated that higher education, like going to college, that when you go to college, it's all this one big giant degree, and you have to take all these gen eds that aren't related to your goal that you're studying, and you have to take whatever courses they feel are relevant to your degree. I got the worst version of this because I went to school for game design, and when you go to school for game design, they try to turn you into a programmer through the back door. They try to just they like wave video games in front of you like a little carrot, and then they're just like behind that door it's just programming for anything other than video games. And in addition to that, there's all your gen eds. And in addition to that, they're trying to prepare you for like every possible job you could have in a video game company. So they want you to be a 3D modeler and a Photoshop expert, and you need to know how to make a website for some fucking reason, like that's at all related. You need to know how to code in multiple completely unrelated languages, and you need to know how to use multiple game design softwares, and by the end of it, you don't know how to make a game. Right? You don't know how to make a game because you've only dipped your toes into like 100 different subjects, and now you're the jack of all trades, master of none. And they could have let you, since it's your money, your education, why do they not allow you to do it piecemeal and learn on a course-by-course basis the exact stuff that you want to learn? Why is that not taken seriously by employers? Why is that not taken seriously by our institutions when it comes to institutional funding for higher education? In general, I think things should be a lot more pluralistic in that way. I would have loved to be a part of like an apprenticeship of some sort specific to a specific game design software that I wanted to learn, but haven't found one yet that like exists. And I'm sure there's something out there, but it's weird that that's not the priority. It's weird that that's not more common.